Welcome to South Asian Environment Dialogue. You know that it's a program being hosted by the Canadian television channel Climate Channel in collaboration with Indian media platform The Plurals. In this program, we discuss a range of issues on climate change, on environment. For the last couple of months, we are doing this on various issues. And from this Sunday, for the next 4 or 5 Sundays, we'll be talking about various climate issues vis-a-vis COP. You know that this is the time of the year when COP usually happens. This year, COVID and all have stopped the COP. So the COP26 from this year has been shifted to next year, 2021. But we take this opportunity to discuss the outstanding issues of COP in this every Sunday program. And today we'll be discussing negotiation. Negotiation next. What is going to happen in negotiation? Before I go on the topics, let me introduce the panel for you. It's a wonderful panel we have. We have Indrajit Bose is a negotiation specialist from Third World Network, and Third World Network is a very important component in the whole COP process. Whenever we go to COP and cover COP, every morning the first thing we always look for is the TWN to know what is happening behind the table and around the table where we are not having access to. I have with me Harjeet Singh. Harjeet is the global climate lead of ActionAid International and a very important part of the civil society in the COPs, and always we exchange views, try to understand the issues. I have me with, in this program, Kashmala Kakakhel. She's a specialist of climate finance. She's also the advisor to Pakistan government on GCF, Green Climate Fund, and been working with governments around South Asia for a number of years on various, I believe, on climate finance issues. So welcome to the show. And finally, I have one of the senior most, I would say, climate expert from the region, Qazi Kholiquzzaman Ahmad. Qazi Saab is from Bangladesh, and at present he's the chairman, I think, of the Dhaka University's economic department, and he's also a development thinker, economist and development thinker, and I believe he's part of Bangladesh delegation so many years he himself has perhaps forgotten about it. So it's a great panel to have with me, and let me start with Indrajit. Indrajit, Madrid ends almost, it looks like a million years ago. With COVID happening in between, everything went topsy-turvy. But I can still remember when Madrid ended after perhaps the longest COP record on record. Everybody accepted, along with the government of the UN position, it was unsatisfactory end. And there were a lot of outstanding issues in the end of the Madrid. Now we are going to have Glasgow next year. In between, from tomorrow, 23rd of November, there is an UN climate dialogue. Though it's not an official negotiation, but I understand parties are involved. COP25 and COP26 presidencies are involved. And also UN is involved directly, even UNFCCC is involved directly. It means that it may not be an official discussion, but definitely a contributor to the negotiation in future. So what is hold in the next? What is going to happen? And what are the issues you feel are going to be important on negotiation in the coming, leading to the COP26?
Right. Thank you, Jayanta, also for inviting me to this rather illustrious panel. Glad to be here. So, yes, before I sort of move to, what is Glasgow going to be like, I will just sort of touch upon a few, contentious issues that happened in Madrid in COP25, which feels like, so long ago. And it was the longest COP in the history of COPs. So first things first, and I will begin from the priority of developing countries and especially South Asian countries. There were a host of finance issues which were very, very troublesome and problematic, very contentious. These include some agendas like the long-term finance, as well as issues around the adaptation fund. Then, so essentially, the developed countries gave the developing countries a very hard time in progressing on any agenda item related to finance. So on long-term finance, the developed countries said that we do not want to have a discussion on long-term finance. And there were certain technicalities that they brought in to say that long-term finance ends in 2020. The name itself suggests that it is long-term. So there were a lot of differences in terms of how to continue the long-term finance. So there were no decisions on several of these. Then, as you would know, that the developed countries have a commitment to mobilize USD 100 billion by per year by 2020. So developing countries essentially called for a review of the $100 billion to say that whether we have achieved, whether the developed countries have actually provided the money or not. But developed countries essentially said that, no, we don't need to discuss any of these issues because OECD is anyway comes up with an annual report of how much money we've been providing. So developing countries were essentially saying that, no, we need a process within the UNFCCC to understand the progress towards the 100 billion. But there was no progress on that because, as you know, the UNFCCC is a consensus-driven process. So there were we didn't really since there was no agreement, we couldn't progress on the issue. Then there's been the long-standing issue of the lack of agreed definition of climate finance. It helps the developed countries because they can put anything and everything as part. It can package anything and everything as part of climate finance. But developing countries were calling for an agreed definition of climate finance. So there was the discussions were quite contentious on that also. So I'm just touching upon these issues. If we have time,
we'll discuss at length afterwards, perhaps. So apart from finance issues, other issues, Indrajit, you feel?
Yeah. So there was loss and damage. Of course, again, financing for loss and damage was an issue. The governance of loss and damage was an issue which was not resolved and which will become an important issue in the COP next year. Then you have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is essentially cooperative approaches, which include the use of market as well as non-market mechanisms to, implement the NDCs, among other factors. So those rules have not been resolved, and they continue to be contentious. And Glasgow, there's going to be considerable emphasis on that. Besides that, there are some differences on transparency as well. Transparency is about countries reporting on their climate action.
Exactly.
And developing countries essentially have flexibilities in terms of how they report and what they report on. But there was no agreement in terms of how to operationalize this particular flexibility.
So transparency is an issue.
So that is an issue. Then, of course, the pre-2020 implementation and ambition gaps of developed countries, that continues to be an issue. And linked to the pre-2020 ambition post-2020 is also going to be like a really, really political hotbed.
These are the broad issues, perhaps.
Broad issues, yeah.
Okay, we'll try to dissect and discuss most of the important issues one by one. Before I come to, because I think climate holds the core of everything, whether it is loss and damage, whether it is long-term finance, that is a core area. So I'll have two very eminent and very specialized person to talk about climate finance and all these issues. But before that, I would like to come to Harjeet, just to Harjeet, about this from this finance part. What are the other outstanding thing you feel are going to be part of negotiations, especially in context to South Asian countries which are being so much impacted by climate change, be it India, be it Pakistan, be it Bangladesh, and for that matter, entire South Asia, they are having one of the major impacts. So what's your take on that? What are the other issues that could come up?
Sure, Jayanta. As Indrajit said, finance is an important issue, but apart from that, for South Asia, which is a disaster hotspot, for us, how we get support, both in terms of finance and capacity building, so that developing countries in this region are far more prepared to respond to these impacts. You know, the term climate emergency has been there now, becoming very popular. And it means that communities are getting impacted now, and they're not prepared for the kind of impacts that they're going to face in future. So what does that mean? And especially when these communities and countries are least responsible for the crisis, and rich countries who have caused the problem, they must come forward and support, and as part of their obligation. That has not happened. Whether you talk about adaptation in terms of finance, in fact, there are studies saying that the money that they're claiming that they've given for adaptation, that is way kind of overstatement, and the methodology that they've used is flawed. So it's only 1/3 of what they're claiming. And similarly on loss and damage, as Indrajit said, the whole issue was around financing. At Madrid, no progress whatsoever except that expert group that was constituted last month, and I'm going to talk about it later. But the reality is that how poor countries and communities are going to be helped, both in terms of preparing for climate impacts and how do they recover from it, that has not made sufficient progress. And that is an outstanding issue, and which should become a key metric of success for COP26. So we need to really unpack that what we are expecting from COP26 to deliver.
Okay, I think that's we need to kind of elaborate further on that. But before that, let me come to Professor Qazi Kholiquzzaman Ahmad. Professor Ahmad, you have heard, I think you and Kashmala both are finance experts. So first I'm coming to you, then I'll come to her. That finance holds the key, whether it's long term, whether it's short term, whether it's loss and damage and all that. So both as a global expert and also from Bangladesh, which is one of the most impacted country, what's your feeling that finance is always an issue, and is COVID coming into the picture? Do you expect that it is going to become even worse now? What's your take?
Thank you very much. As you said, finance has been an issue. It has been, in fact. And we have been discussing, there were commitments made, but not delivered. That has been the case. And just we heard a few things about finance just from the first speaker. The GCF is not getting the finance that it's expected to get. Only 10 billion for the first period, and then 2 billion withdrawn by the US. So it was 8 down to 8. Now another 10 billion has been committed. But we were expecting there would be by now about 50, 60 billion. So there is no money. And then again, on the finance, it was supposed to be grant and predictable, and also over and above the ODA. But this GCF is functioning, it's co-financing now. They don't give any grant straight away, it has to be co-finance. And also you can borrow at a very low interest rate from GCF. So the rules of the game have been changed. And this is the powerful countries, they change rules whenever they think it is fit. The other thing is about private sector financing. And I have been skeptical about that for a long, long time, and I've been mentioning it in the negotiations also. If private sector is not interested in adaptation, they might be interested in mitigation in developing countries, but no way adaptation. And adaptation is not a source of profit. That is the poor people who are suffering, they have to be assisted and so on. So it's not coming. Therefore, finance is going to be a critical issue. Talk of technology, talk of capacity building, talk of whatever else. It's, as you said, finance is the crucial issue.
So finance remains a critical issue.
Yeah.
And you were skeptical about the private finance?
Very much, yeah. Yes.
Okay.
On the adaptation, particularly on the
adaptation part. Okay, let's take Kashmala Kakakhel, her opinion on that. What do you feel that you are a climate finance expert for quite some time and many years, and then you are also, I think, advising Pakistan government on GCF issues. So, are these funds that really there, or they are all being in theories? What is the current situation, and what are your expectation?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, and it's a pleasure sitting here discussing the issues of climate change across great colleagues from India and Bangladesh. Absolutely. There are funds, they are available currently. How much, again, we can talk about the needs over here, how much is available, whether that's enough to cover the issues that we have on ground in most of the developing countries that we see right now. So funds are available. We talk about, it's about the size of the pie. So it's small. How much money? We talked about pledging $100 billion 2020 onwards, and we've been talking about this for the last many years. But as one of our panelists just mentioned, yes, we've just had about 10 billion, and now GCF went into a second replenishment where they got another 9 billion. It's also about how you count the money. So if you ask the developed countries, they'll say, yes, we've already, if you look at there's different studies out there and different documents that they've been producing, which basically says, yes, over the years, private and public sector has been above 100 billion or close to 200 billion, etc. But when you actually look at the core of it, it's money that is, the private sector money is primarily going to the international private sector. And again, we can talk about the loans and how that money is not really being, it's the loan element, which is money that, yes, it goes out, but it actually goes back into their own pockets. So how do you count the money ultimately is what is important over here. So we can sit and discuss till the cows come home about how much money is actually in there, but if it's actually being spent in the right place or not. So one is that, and the other is, of course, the size of the pie. So while we have the GCF, and yes, we have had a successful first replenishment period, but at the same time, we also had a new, we approved the updated strategic plan, which is deciding where this money will be spent for the next 4 years. And in that, one of the major issues or the disagreement that you saw within the two sides of the developed and developing countries is primarily the infamous 2.1c, the Article 2.1c in the Paris Agreement, where there's a push to make financial flows consistent with pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions. And given that developed countries want to talk about climate finance only when it is consistent with the greenhouse gas emission pathway, that becomes a bit problematic when most of our countries are now in the industrialized period, and you want to sort of tag or link climate finance only to a time or to a situation, or you're putting a condition on it, becomes a bit problematic. So yes, there are multiple fights that we have to keep fighting. It's an ongoing sort of discourse. If there's someone who looks at this discussion, say from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it might seem like we're saying the same things and we're sort of jogging in the same place. And sometimes it does feel like that, but ultimately you realize that's how it is, and you have to constantly try and push for and explaining what the needs on ground are and try and align finances accordingly.
Absolutely. I think having covered number of COPs, I always find that this whole discussion about money going in rounds. Every year, every COP, almost it goes in rounds and rounds and rounds. So before I go to the other negotiation topics, let me ask a very quick, I request a very quick response from both of you, maybe Professor Ahmed first and then Kashmala. Is that, do you expect the situation to change leading to Glasgow? Because I asked this question, because this COVID can play in two ways. One is that in the COVID, the economy has been gone down, so there's no money, so even the money will become even less. Otherwise, there's an understanding that COVID has explored that understanding, the impact, the possible impact of climate change that can happen on this world. So there may be an understanding, okay, if this is a trailer, the actual film is much bigger. So if that understanding comes, it may play another round. So Professor Ahmed, what are your expectation? Do you expect the money to go up or being static or even go down? With this? You were part of CDM. You were part of CDM at I think number of years. So what's your expectation of that?
Thank you for the question. Now, you see, over the years, I have been at the table negotiating, and I didn't see much improvement. And this time round, there is COVID. So I'm not very hopeful that there will be increase in money because COVID has to be addressed. That's essential.
Okay.
It's a life and death question. But this is a pandemic, and it will be solved maybe 1 year or 2 years time. But climate change is an existential threat for the humanity and the earth itself. And therefore, that cannot be ignored at all. So its issue is actually political. That's why I say it's political. So you do more politics than science. Science tells us what to do, and we have the technology to overcome all these problems.
Okay, so you are not that hopeful. You are not that hopeful.
I'm not very hopeful now.
You are not that hopeful. Fine.
But just one sentence. I'm not very hopeful, but then we should keep negotiating.
Okay, okay. And Kashmala, along with this question, a very small supplementary one. US new government, Joe Biden becoming the president and saying good things about climate change. Is it going to change the equation a bit? What's your take?
So let's take the first question first. Yes. Will the money increase? So it's interesting how the money will increase. Maybe in numbers it increases, but then you ask, where is the money coming from? You will see that suddenly or strategically or over time, development finance is now being repackaged as climate finance. So there is money that was already coming down to developing countries for different other initiatives for poverty reduction, etc., which is now being repackaged as climate finance, so that while you don't know whether the pie has increased, but you're calling it climate finance. So maybe in absolute terms, as you go next year or as we go down the road while we are negotiating, we continue to do so. You might see the pie expand, but the question we need to ask is, where are the resources being reduced from and actually put under the climate finance channel for us to actually see whether this is new and additional or whether this is money that has been repackaged as climate finance. Okay. So something to look at closely. On Biden, interesting. Yes, he says he will join the Paris Agreement the day that he becomes president. Hopefully Trump will let him do so in peace. And they say, I was looking at the terms and conditions, and it basically said he just needs to send a letter and say we're in, and if that happens within 30 days or so, the US will be back in the negotiations. It obviously, in the sense that, yes, it's good to have as many countries be involved in these international agreements, but at the same time, I feel the world sort of has moved on from where we were 4 years ago. There are other players, there are other, there's countries even as small as, like for example, Pakistan's emissions. We'll come to that maybe separately, but we've moved on in the last 4 years. We're helping ourselves. We are putting in domestic resources into doing things differently than we were. So once the US comes back, yes, whether it will put in more money, it has to, because it has to, if it's coming back, then of course it has certain responsibilities to fulfill. But at the same time, how important is it to have the US? I mean, we didn't have it in a big way in the last 3 or 4 years, but the world moved on, right? Things still moved on, and it's not that the negotiations came halting to a screech.
So the world has moved on in the last 4 years when US chose to come out of Paris. Indrajit, we discussed finance quite a bit, but there are other outstanding issues. And one is the ambition that I'm going to ask you and Harjeet one after one. That ambition is a major issue. I think report after report are very clearly saying that what the NDCs are being promised, even the governments execute 100% of their promises, they keep their promises, still it will be awfully short of what the world needs. So ambition has to be raised. So that is the ground reality. But the figures that we have are not very encouraging. And again, this is a COVID background, this pandemic background. Do you expect the ambition to be really raised by the important countries? Because small countries raising, I was looking at a report where 80 countries collectively, they said about increasing ambition, and these countries cover about 10.5% of the global emission. But what about the big guys? What about the US? What about China? US is just coming back. China is there. So what about this? So what is your expectation on ambition raise of the core countries? Not I'm talking about the fringe countries who really don't have much ambition in the first place.
So yeah, if I can go first. So I think we'd have to nuance this ambition discussion a little bit. There are two parts to it, and I'll probably just present 3 points of view of mine. So first is a pre-2020 ambition, right? So there, which was largely the responsibility of the developed countries to have met a certain, to have reduced a certain amount of emissions and to have provided certain amount of financing to developing countries. Now, on both those counts, reports have shown that they haven't done their bit. And the responsibility has basically moved on to the post-2020 world. Now, if you compare the US and China, there are reports that say that China is doing almost equal or a little more than its fair share. So as far as the US is concerned, they're far away from their fair share. And so when I say fair share, it's basically the historical responsibility of causing the climate crisis. So there you cannot put US and China at the same level. China may be the world's biggest current emitter, but US is the world's, historically the biggest emitter. So, and with the US not taking action, it is like it's actually affected the way the way the world will not be able to achieve the temperature target of 1.5 degrees, and for which the poor people, especially in developing countries, will pay mostly with their lives. So we have to think of ambition from this context, from the context of equity, so that who does how much.
Exactly.
So it is important now that the Biden administration is back. I'm just hopeful, and this is hoping against hope, that the US increases its ambition in terms of what it will do to reduce its emissions and how much it will reduce its emissions, and also provide support to developing countries. So it's a very interesting, most of the developing countries speak of ambition, not just in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation as well as finance, technology, and capacity building support that they receive. So, and just with COVID, you have seen how India and Pakistan and Bangladesh have been affected by either cyclones or locust attacks. It's unprecedented. So it just makes our economy go worse. And so we are battling with climate, we are battling with COVID. So we're just at a much more disadvantaged situation. So yes, all countries must raise their ambition, but the ambition is not just mitigation. The ambition in terms of support should also be raised.
Okay, so broadly, what you are saying, that raising ambition will be a major challenge. It will not be an easy thing to do at this point of time when the world is grappling with COVID and recession the way. But Harjeet, the world is also grappling with the climate impacts. There are huge climate impacts, and especially the South Asian countries are at the kind of feeling the brunt of it. So what's your take on that? How you marry this raising climate impact and COVID and the other challenges? As a civil society champion, what's your take on that?
So Jayanta, before I go and talk about loss and damage, let me say a couple of lines in addition to what Indrajit said about the US.
Sure.
I'm also cautiously optimistic about US coming back to negotiations, as Kashmala also mentioned. The world has moved on, but the reality is the kind of emissions US has cumulatively and also in future, we cannot ignore the US completely. So what US does or doesn't do, it has an impact on climate as well as negotiations and the progress that we make going forward. Let me share some data just to put things into context. The reality is, since 1990, US emissions have gone up by 6% until 2018, and this is United States government's own data, right? So instead of reducing their emissions, they have increased their emissions. Although in the pie, their share has gone down because China's emissions have increased, but their overall emissions have rather increased and not reduced. I think which is really, really worrisome. And as Indrajit said, right now they're only doing 1/5 of their fair share, and then they use 2005 as a base year and not 1990, which the European Union is using. Another thing that's quite worrying, which may change, and again Indrajit referred to the package the stimulus that US has come out with, which is $2.98 trillion. And out of that, only $39 billion is going towards green projects, which is again quite worrying. In comparison to European Union, which has 37% of its funding going for green recovery. So there's a marked difference between actions when it comes to European Union and United States. So that's quite worrisome. Now the ray of hope. Very interestingly, Fox News was sharing this data that 70% of US citizens now want green investments, which is quite remarkable. Another thing that that gives me hope is this time the way climate
20% of those voted for Donald Trump.
Imagine, yeah, exactly. And this time the way climate was discussed during presidential elections, that is unprecedented. And the movement, the Sunrise Movement, that has helped Joe Biden win, in fact, came up with a statement after the results were announced saying, we helped you win and now we are watching you. So which means there is a huge bottom-up pressure this time in the US, and which is very different from what it has been over the last few decades. So that's what gives me hope that yes, there is going to be a change, and it's not only us, sitting in the developing world who have to watch what US is doing. This time, US citizens are also beginning to watch their government on climate change. So I'm hopeful on that count much more. But of course, when it comes to their international responsibility on giving finance, there are big questions around it. So that's where we as civil society in the global south, in South Asia, have to play a very important role to keep pressure on the US.
But what about the disasters? That's an initial question of mine. There's a plethora of disasters across South Asia. But as Indrajit pointed out, at Kashmala pointed out, at Professor Ahmad pointed out, there are issues of finance. Then COVID is holding it back. So how do you feel the global leaders can marry this problems of COVID, but the need for more finance, and also to counter this whole process of climate impacts, the disasters and all that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so the reality is quite grim. As I was sharing earlier, the money that they claim rich countries have given for adaptation, it's only 1/3 that's real. Rest is full of loans and guarantees, as Kashmala was talking about. What you count as climate finance, that's a major challenge. And so the commitment that was made, even that commitment is not being delivered in reality. And developing countries, as Indrajit was saying, now they're battered by also disasters. Climate disasters are not waiting for COVID to be over. So a double whammy that many South Asian countries are facing, and they really don't have resources. And I think that's where we need to make sure that the global system works. And that's how, as again I said earlier, the success on how we make finance available for addressing loss and damage at COP26 should become a metric of success, which is not the reality right now. So the UK government is only looking at ambition or so-called net zero targets as their metric for success. We should not allow that to happen. We should make the agenda far more comprehensive. We should make sure that money is delivered on ramping up ambition on adaptation as well as responding to disasters. And that's where South Asian governments have a very important role to play. While they are spending their own money, they should also make sure that the international system works.
Professor Ahmed, I think very important and interesting point being raised by Harjeet, that the South Asian countries, the developing bloc, needs to widen up the negotiation issues. Don't really allow the so-called the developed countries to fix the issues in a narrow way, so that the issues concerning us are left out. So from Bangladesh, what do you feel are Bangladesh's more major agendas in the Glasgow? What Bangladesh should be talking about?
Okay, just one other point about the loss and damage. This is something I think it's up in the air. Attribution question will be there, and it can be long negotiations, even if we agreed on loss and damage. And compensation is not a word that they would like to hear. So I think loss and damage will not go very far. So we have to concentrate on adaptation funding technology for adaptation, and also displacement of people. A lot of people are being displaced, but we failed to get that in the Paris Agreement, in fact, displacement. It was in COP decision, not in the agreement. But that's very, very important for India, for, I don't know about Pakistan, but Bangladesh as well. The people are being displaced, river erosion, the salinity ingress, and so on and so forth. So this is Bangladesh, of course, one is, of course, ambition we'll be talking about. We'll be demanding that ambition be raised, that financing is the other thing, and adaptation financing in particular. Bangladesh will be very interested, and we'll be talking about that. And displacement, we will be pushing forward. This is something we have been doing, displacement, climate-induced displacement. This is a large issue in Bangladesh, but it didn't get a place in Paris Agreement. So these are the key issues that we will. But one other thing about we will demand one thing, that COVID-19 is there, fine. We have to address that. And we can't, while we postpone negotiations, we can't postpone climate action. Action has to take place.
Okay.
And that, I think, is critical, climate action. Negotiation, okay, we know lots of things. We have done negotiations on many aspects. And we have some agreements. We entered into some agreements. So deliver what you have agreed first, and then we'll negotiate for the future.
Next. Okay, deliver what you have agreed. And you said that adaptation and displacement are the major issues from the Bangladesh point of view, and you're not that hopeful about loss and damage.
No, ambition is something else. We are very interested. Developed countries should raise their ambition so that we don't have
ambition needs to be
adapt. Okay. We can't adapt. If things go the way it is going, more and more devastating natural disasters, how can we adapt?
Absolutely. But you are not hopeful about loss and damage. You are not very hopeful about loss and damage. I'm sure Harjeet has got to talk about that. I'll come to that later.
I participated in that discussion, and I didn't see it going very far.
Okay. I still remember before I come to Kashmala,
Question will be raised is attribution. We won't be able to agree on attribution. We say it's climate change, they will say no, it's natural. So you go on.
Professor Ahmad, it reminds me an event happened when Hassan Mahmood Saab actually was part of he actually introduced Bangladesh was very instrumental about introducing the loss and damage factor. I remember that walking along the long corridor and talking about it. Yes, absolutely. Kashmala, from Pakistan's point of view, now, what do you think that, considering the whole package that we are talking about, this ambition, finance, and then loss and damage and all that, what are the Pakistan's major agendas you feel are going to be in Glasgow?
So I don't want to repeat what the other colleagues have said. And yes, as South Asia, given the sort of the geography that we share and the sort of disasters that we face collectively, of course, there's adaptation and then there's loss and damage, a very key area. Yes, there's the attribution issue. We've been looking at loss and damage for the last, say, since about a decade now. And yes, the negotiations are also sort of running in the same place, absolutely. But that doesn't mean you stop talking about them. You keep pushing, you keep talking. Those are our real issues. But at the same time, I think sort of looking at this from a fresh pair of eyes now, the negotiations, you see where everything is going. You have the Green New Deal with the EU, and you have everybody talking about shifting financial flows, etc. So for me, maybe if I were to look at it from a slightly not like pillar perspective in terms of this is what we want on adaptation, that's what we want on loss and damage, I would look at it slightly differently and say, when you want to talk about engaging the private sector, let's talk about our domestic private sector.
Okay.
What is it that we can bring in, and how is it? Yes, when you talk about the private sector, you can only engage them when there's profits involved. Yes, we know there are no profits in adaptation. Yes, we know there are no profits in loss and damage. And I'm not even talking about that. So that's a separate piece, and that's very critical and very important. As an add-on, when you talk about, yes, we need to move on and we need to move towards a low carbon trajectory overall, as globally, if we do, then it's not just the international private sector that needs to play the role. We need to try and focus. We have great entrepreneurs. We have the youth coming up. We have the private sector in place, great ideas, but not the capacity and not the space and not the technology at hand to actually be doing these things, to actually be taking a step forward in supporting the climate action. So one, definitely try and see how we can provide space for the private sector from our countries to be part of the larger conversation. And secondly, what I would like to watch out more for from the way these negotiations are now being built is that there's no way of an elusive or an intrinsic way in which they try and build some barriers to trade and investment. And you see a lot of that conversation happening where there are non-tariff barriers being put in place, and that would really worry me going forward. And I can't really pinpoint exactly which negotiation stream that would be for, but that's an area overall that Pakistan would be interested in watching very closely going forward.
Okay, I think very interesting points. Indrajit, if we come to India, you assess the entire negotiation. India is a different ballgame from the other South Asian countries, simply because it is one of the most vulnerable country. I think as per the German Watch Index, India for the last few years being the most vulnerable, and also it is the most vulnerable over the couple of decades. In fact, a gross number. All at the same time, India being accused of kind of contributing to the climate change by the emission that it has of the huge population that it has. So India is a different kind of scenario from, say, Bangladesh, Pakistan, naturally the other countries in South Asia. So what India you feel can go to the negotiation? What are the agendas for India in the Glasgow, leading to Glasgow?
I think it's very clear that finance is a very, very important agenda for India. India has championed finance in the past as well, to say that because of the reasons you mentioned, because of the vulnerabilities and because of the kind of impacts the country is facing. In fact, the whole of Indian subcontinent, and Kashmala mentioned, we share the same geography. So we all face similar kind of impacts. But Absolutely. Since I have to speak only on India, so I'm saying that I think finance is very important, as it is important for the region. Also, in terms of ambition, so nobody is, I think India can and must do what it is able to on its own,
okay,
and should have ambitious action, which it already does as far as reports are concerned. But yeah, it must do. It must ask for that support. India has pushed the equity agenda like no other country. In fact, India is part of the like-minded developing countries, and not just India. You have Pakistan as well as Sri Lanka. So there are 3 South Asian countries in this particular grouping, part of the LMDCs, who have pushed for equity. And I think it is very important to, as Dr. Ahmad said, that, deliver. And I think that is the push that India and the other developing countries really need to go there in Glasgow and say that deliver what you've agreed on climate finance. Absolutely. And raise your ambition and help us raise ours.
And that holds true for all the kind of commitments, not only finance. For example, Kyoto, what you have kind of committed, you are not delivering. So that is something being, I think, consistent with all the major negotiation points where the kind of developed countries committed but haven't done, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. This is just, and I had broadened it. This is not just finance, but when we are asking the developed countries to deliver on their promises, it is as far as emissions reductions is concerned, and to increase the emission reduction.
Okay.
So the whole, to basically respect the UNFCCC premise, to respect equity, to take responsibility for their action, and to help the poorer countries or the developing countries not adopt the same development trajectory.
Absolutely. I'm coming to Harjeet, but before that, Indrajit, a very small question. That you were talking about the India needing finance or India needing support. But I remember that even from Jairam Ramesh time, I remember it's from Cancun itself. India is a kind of a scenario that whether it feels that it's a big enough country having his own resource, not really asking for finance support, but at the same time, it projects itself as a country being most vulnerable. So there is a dichotomy with India's position also, that actually, does India require or need support? Do they ask for support? I'm not sure, apart from the GCF and other CDM related projects. As a country, is India asking for support?
I think the short answer is yes. It is asking for support, and it is asking for support quite vociferously within the negotiations. It's just that there is a certain narrative that Western media likes to portray, but it's not true. India does need support, which it articulates very well. When India is talking about ambition, when India is talking about implementing decisions, when India is talking about essentially their NDCs being needing support for implementation, it is asking for finance. It is asking for technology support. So, yeah, I mean, it's.
Maybe the language is different.
I don't know.
The language is different.
No, I think it is pretty clear. They ask for support. They couldn't ask it more clearly. So if you're in, and I think Kashmala will also vouch for it, because we have been in finance negotiations together, and it is there's no ambiguity about it.
No ambiguity about it. Fine, great. It's a very clear answer. I was confused about that. Harjeet, first of all, let me talk Professor Ahmed's point of view that loss and damage has not really a great future. So what's your take on that? Because loss and damage is something which is very critical to a major portion of the people around the world, definitely, but also in South Asia. As you know, we often talk about the Sundarbans. Bangladesh and India share Sundarbans, and there's a huge population who live within Sundarban in India, and in case of Bangladesh around Sundarban, have been highly impacted, and they virtually contributed nothing to this climate cauldron. So adaptation and mitigation are going to save them in future, but what about the damages they have suffered, Harjeet? So if you take away the loss and damage instrument from the whole negotiation table, it becomes a different ballgame. What do you think, Harjeet?
Totally agree, Jayanta. And yeah, I have a slight disagreement with what Professor Ahmed said. So instead of now saying that whether this disaster can be attributed to climate change, I think the popular sentiment is, and which is a scientific analysis, that each climatic disaster has a handprint or footprint of climate change in one way or the other. I think we should start looking at it that way, the way we have seen the trend, whether it comes to sea level rise or increasing cyclones, floods, drought, or other disasters. That's one. And if you ask me to choose, and we should not, or we keep advocating for a comprehensive action coming from these negotiations. But if I'm forced to choose one issue, and not because I work on it, I think I would choose loss and damage, because that is the litmus test of whether climate action is working or not. Why are we doing mitigation? To protect people and the planet. Why do we do adaptation? To protect people and the planet. And if we are not able to save people and planet from climate impacts, there is no point going to these negotiations. And trust me, mitigation will happen on its own as well, because developed countries also realize, because there's a clear connection to clean air, clean water. So these are all also becoming domestic issues. But loss and damage in the global south and the support that rich countries need to offer, that's not being discussed at the national level in UK and Europe and US of the world. That issue is a global issue. It's a global justice issue, and we need to be talking about it. There's one more point I would like to add, Jayanta, which is beyond loss and damage, and referring to what Kashmala said. I think she made a very important reference to trade issue. In these negotiations, it's not only important what we get out of it. It's also important what we protect. And the fact is, rich countries are now moving in the direction where they are going to create so many barriers. And European Union is already working on something called carbon border adjustment mechanism. And it's being discussed. It's going to get real very much. And I think that should become an important issue for India as well. So these negotiations are not only going to be, and have never been, only about climate. Trade is so neatly intertwined with these issues So I think what she said is very relevant also for region. Look at Bangladesh, how much garment industry is dependent on exports. And same is true for Pakistan, same is true for Sri Lanka when it comes to tea. So there's a huge export that we have. And if we have these kind of trade barriers in the name of climate and carbon, it's going to be very difficult for the region.
So I think that's fascinating. I think, and I think let me ask a very straight question to the entire panel. Harjeet has flagged it up. That are we as country, as individual country in South Asia, are we pushing loss and damage less? Are we doing enough to push loss and damage at the global negotiation platform? I'm asking this because Harjeet has flagged off that it is a problem mainly with the countries like us. US, Europe they do have problem, but not in this scale. But having faced the problem, are we really pushing it in the negotiating table strong enough? What's the point? What's the kind of take? Professor Ahmad, what's your thing? That Bangladesh, he started the loss and damage issue.
Bangladesh is pushing it. What I said was my evaluation of the situation.
Absolutely.
And having talked to the people, and compensation, at the heart of it is compensation. This word is not acceptable. So can we push hard to get them to accept this word compensation? So let's try. Bangladesh is very up and doing about loss and damage. Bangladesh is negotiating. But my take is that it will not go very far. Because I'm very candid. I always say what I feel very strongly. So this is something I very strongly see. Therefore, I think along with that, we have to push displacement issue, climate displacement issue, as well as adaptation funding. You see, GCF, how much money you are getting? Bangladesh has got 100 million only so far. So there's absolutely nothing. We need billions, and we got only 100 million. And on the negotiation of the loss and damage thing, I have been in some discussions when I don't go up very much now. I think last one I went in 2016. After that, I have stopped going to the negotiations. But before that, the issue was there, and I didn't feel very strongly that it will go.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. That what he was talking about.
But it is important enough to push for.
It's very important, and absolutely, I think all panelists agree on that point. Is important. Kashmala, what's your take on that?
So the way I would look at it is more on a time frame. So when the UNFCCC negotiations started, I'm talking about early 90s, we just knew about mitigation, right? So mitigation has been in the air for the last 30 years. And then you realize 10 years down the line, you realize we can keep talking, you can mitigate all you want, but unless and until you adapt to the impacts of climate change, it'll be very difficult on ground, right? So early 2000s, you start talking about adaptation, and now adaptation has been in the mainstream for the last 20 years. Loss and damage is something we picked up when we realized while we are even adapting, we are mitigating, we're adapting, but the impacts still very much are on ground, and loss and damage is happening. And this is an area that we need to pick up. And yes, Bangladesh was one of the few countries that took the lead on for the LDCs to present its case in a very big way in Durban. 2012. What was that? Qatar, right?
Yeah.
Doha, yes. So I think that's when Bangladesh really put its best foot forward on actually presenting its case on loss and damage. And so since it's now, we've just been talking about it for 10 years now. So I feel it's not that it's a lost cause, it's just that it's a new cause. And therefore we need to talk more about it and try
Perhaps
and get more.
Perhaps you need to repackage it. Perhaps you need to repackage it, as Harjeet is also talking about. And I think in different languages, both Professor Ahmad and Harjeet talking about kind of repackaging it in a manner. But it's a very important issue, and it will continue to be an important issue. We have 2 or 3 minutes time. So just a final question to all of you, maybe starting with, maybe Kashmala, maybe starting with you only, that 2021, COP26, COP25, in the last number of COPs, apart from Paris, everywhere, the last day, a prolonged deliberation, and then a highly compromised, diluted agreement. That's my editor says me, what's the point in going every year and reporting? You know what is going to happen in the last day. My editor actually told me, we were having a coffee together, he told me, what's the point? The same copy, you can actually kind of copy paste the copies from earlier years, just changing the languages and all that. So is this trend going to change in Glasgow post-COVID, Kashmala? What do you feel about it? That again, the same thing will come out or change? Expectation from Glasgow, very quick.
Let me look into my crystal ball and let you know. It's difficult to predict, but yes, it'll be more of the same. Yes, COVID, people move on and they forget about the troubles that they've had, and then we'll go back to status quo. But again, for me, it's not about the negotiations. Yes, let's remember, we had Paris Agreement in 2015, 5 years ago. We took 5 years to develop a rule book. We have everything down to the T on most of it, right? Yes, there are a few outstanding issues from Katowice, which then went on to Madrid, and then now they will go on. But those are just literally the last few points. By and large, we have everything agreed. It's not in the negotiations anymore. It's in the human behavior. It's in how the governments will actually respond to it. So it can be the last day, the last minute, the last whatever. But unless and until we decide, once we all go home and change the way, those who need to give the money should be giving the money, those who need to transfer technology should be transferring technology, and so on and so forth. Common but differentiated responsibilities, right? Unless and until we all go home and start doing things differently, the last day will always be the last day, and it'll be more of the same each time, whether it's COP26, 7, 8, whenever.
Absolutely. Professor Ahmed, what's your take? Are you hopeful Glasgow will be different?
There will be discussions on the key issues, I'm sure, but whether or not we'll be able to agree.
No, I'm saying the overall Glasgow conference, the COP26, hopefully that everything will be in order. There'll be no kind of rerun of COVID that again threatens, that's a different ball game. But as of now, the Glasgow conference in 2021, do you feel it will be different from the previous ones since Paris, and we'll have a more successful COP?
More successful COP, I can't say now. We'll have to see.
Finger crossed.
Every time we went there with great hope. We went to Cancun, we went to Copenhagen with a great hope that there.
It was called Copenhagen. It was called Copenhagen at the point of time.
I am now more cautious. So we'll be negotiating and see what results come up.
Okay.
Actually, it is political. The whole thing boils down.
Everything is political.
I was coordinating lead author for 2 assessments, IPCC.
Yes.
Science was fine. When we wrote summary for policymakers, it all became politics. So science is undermined.
That is a different story, and someday we'll talk about it. How the scientists have to rework the languages to satisfy the politician in the final report. That's something. Harjeet, what's your point? Are you hopeful about Glasgow? Because a lot of external pressure is not being created. I think you all recognize that it's now a different ball game. Now the youngsters are on road. They are putting a lot of pressure, and people are saying never ever. There's such a difference between the outside of the COP hall and the inside of the COP hall. So that pressure is being felt by the countries. And also this COVID is also pushing the environmental concern. So Harjeet, another routine COP, or you feel something different?
You picked up exactly what I wanted to say. It's not about what happens in the COP. It's about what happens because of these COPs and around these COPs. I think that's very important. And all the mobilization that has happened is because we are meeting every year. Let's look at how this year has been a dull year for climate action because we did not have a COP. How young people could not mobilize. How we have those major moments where this issue have been would have been in media in a very big way. So we have actually lost a year of action. So, and if you look at all the progress that we have made on solar technology, and China is committing to a major target of 2060. Yes. I was just reading a report which said if China commits to electrify its vehicles, it's going to change the entire economic system in many ways because of the sheer size of China's economy. So there's a lot happening, back home, and not on these negotiations. Again, Kashmala referred to that. It's not about what document comes out from these COPs, which is important, but that's not the only thing we should look at. We should look at it much more comprehensively and focus on action in countries, and that's where we are, heading. And I think the mobilization part is extremely important. The pressure that's coming from young people, from ordinary citizens, that is definitely going to increase by the time we reach Glasgow.
Indrajit, put it bluntly, what Harjeet said, that that the whole negotiation will be actually negotiated outside. The market will be negotiating now. As you said, the China, if electrified, will be a different ball game. So, first of all, Glasgow will be a routine COP, or you expect it to be successful? And very quick supplementary is that, will the climate COPs will remain as important as they are, or they have been the last decade, or they are going to lose importance?
Okay, so yeah, as far as hope is concerned, I honestly don't know what to say. I would like to be hopeful, but I would like to be hopeful only when, speaking from a negotiations point of view, if developing countries can protect their development space in these negotiations and protect their people against climate impacts. So I would be hopeful only on that count. As far as climate negotiations are concerned, yes, they will continue to be relevant for a long time. This is primarily because of, if you do not implement the decisions that you've taken, we have subsequent rounds of global stock takes coming up, which will assess, countries' efforts. So it is going to be quite relevant and important, and we'll see how countries respond.
So you say that it makes sense for us to go to next COP and report, or not really?
Absolutely, you must.
We should
Absolutely.
go back and report again.
Yes.
So on that great note, I think I had a wonderful discussion and a wonderful panel. Thanks to all the experts being so eloquent and being kind of touched upon all the issues. I know that climate issues are not very easy issues. They are complicated issues and there are difficulties, but I hope the people who are listening and seeing this program will be a lot benefited, because end of the day, the climate hits your home. It has to be understood, whatever being negotiated within those four worlds in the kind of various cities across the world. End of the day, when Amphan strikes, it's your window which is going to be shaken. It's your house which will be impacted. It's your roadside tree that will be go haywire. Kolkata, which is way away from the Amphan point from Sundarban, being hugely impacted. I know that Bangladesh also had the same experience. Kashmala knows much more than me what's happening in Pakistan. So end of the day, people are being affected. So this negotiation should take into concern the people need. Otherwise, it makes no point, because we are basically negotiating the non-negotiable. It's the human life, it's the world existence. So with that note, thank you everybody again for being so wonderful in this panel. So another great discussion. Thank you. And I think definitely somewhere down we'll be again discussing another critical issues on climate change and environment. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Recording switch.